Oliver Berliner for about 12 years. When I was editor of the Antique Phonograph News, he would write to me sometimes with information to add to some of the articles I was writing. And when I wrote the book, Berliner Gramophone, he helped edit it, which was really great. And all that time I sort of dropped a hint that it would be really nice if he came by and was here for a meeting. And after 12 years, everything finally seemed to line up, and we were able to get him here today. So this is very exciting for all of us, I know. As you probably know, our speaker, Oliver Berliner, is the grandson of the inventor Emile Berliner, who invented the flat disc record, a format that has been around for more than 100 years and is still being produced today, which is a testament to how great an invention it was. You may not be aware that Emile Berliner also invented the microphone and was instrumental in making the telephone a success, because Alexander Graham Bell desperately needed a microphone for his telephone to make it a viable product. So we owe Emile Berliner for that too. When Emile Berliner sold his patents, he moved his operations here up to Canada, where he founded really the Canadian recorded music industry in 1900. And Oliver's uncle Herbert and his father Edgar were instrumental in running that company that was founded here in the early heydays of the record production and the Victor Talking Machine Company. Oliver is the only member of the family who's currently still in the industry. He's a publisher. He's been a guest of Her Royal Highness Princess Margaret to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the invention of the gramophone. He was up here in 2000 to accept a Juno Award on behalf of his family for 100 years of the music industry in Canada. So it is my absolute great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Oliver Berliner.
The problem with speaking to you cats is that I have to be very careful, because you see, you know more about it than I do. And I'm not kidding, I'm not exaggerating. So, for the first time in all the talks that I've given, I actually made notes, because I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I probably will anyway. Incidentally, if you think that I'm high-hatting you by wearing a tie, when it certainly is not necessary, there is a surreptitious reason for it, which is that last night I spilled gravy on my shirt. So there we are. Okay. I'm going to have to, because there's so many things to tell you, and I've decided, because you know so much more about it than I, and because you are collectors and I am not, the thing to do would be to tell you a few little things that didn't make it into the history books, and I hope you'll find them interesting, if not pleasant, surprises. So here we go, and I'm going to incidentally not dwell on any particular subject. And if you want to hear more in depth, I'm going to be here for most of the afternoon. So feel free to come by and talk my ear off. Limit of 6 minutes. Per person. When I give talks like this, and as I assure you, this one is going to be like no other. I always say, since we're talking about inventions, I put a challenge to you. And actually today there's going to be 2 challenges to you, both of which I think you'll love. At any rate, the first one is, what do you think is the greatest invention of them all, besides the wheel, of course? Be thinking about it. And when you do think, consider the greatest invention being the one most beneficial to mankind. Think about it, and when my story is done, I will ask you to, anybody who wants to speak up, to say what you think is the most beneficial invention for mankind. And then I will tell you what I think. And I don't know. I just think. And been fortunate enough that whenever I mention it to people, they are astounded and say, good heavens, you're right. So far, I've been right. And I don't want to come here and find out. Okay. Now, you know, Grandpa's greatest invention was his first invention. You guys are all interested in the gramophone, but as Mark pointed out, he also was responsible for the telephone transmitter, which we call a microphone. And that really was his greatest invention. The gramophone is actually a follow-on to other inventions that preceded it. Speaking of that, as you know better than I, Charles Cros was the man who conceived recording on a disc. And I always wonder, and I think we should give more attention to Cros. Can you imagine this man conceived disc recording, never got any credit or any money? That's too bad. Anyway, I like to mention it because he was Grandpa's inspiration. And it's just sad when so many people who were responsible for great things went unheralded and unsung. At any rate, the great thing about Grandpa's mic was that he didn't know that you couldn't do it. So he went and did it. Now there was another Frenchman by the name of Comte du Moncel who was a leading electrician of the era. And by the way, they called them in that era electricians, but we call them today electrical engineers. At any rate, the French were very advanced in that sort of thing. And the Comte du Moncel absolutely confirmed and ascertained that that no current would pass in a circuit if the contacts didn't touch. And they had to touch very firmly. Now, Grandpa didn't know that, so he went and did it the wrong way. And it defied the thinking of the era.
Just a second.
What he did was, he, as you probably have heard the story, was visiting his friend, a telegraph operator for the Washington, D.C. Fire Department. They communicated from station to station by way of the telegraph. And one day, Alvin Richards, the telegraph operator, invited the young Emile to come, and he was 26 at the time. I guess he was young. Try your hand at the key, Emile. And there was a spare key there. And Emile started to plunk down on the key. And Richard said, no, Emile, you don't understand. You have to press harder. We must have a firm contact. Otherwise, they won't get the message at the other end of the line. And he said, in fact, we cannot use women as telegraph operators because they're not strong enough. And that was that's what he said. At any rate, Emile said to him, you mean a loose contact or a less than firm contact would allow current to pass? Sure it will. But Comte du Moncel said that's not possible. Okay? At any rate, my grandfather went back to his garret and actually built a model, which you've all heard of or seen, the famous little drum on which he pushed a pin through the head of the drum, dangled a wire with a metal ball on the end of it in front of the pin, and when you spoke into the drum, your sound waves from your voice or any other source of sound vibrated, the little ball bounced against the pin in sympathy with the sound waves that were making the diaphragm vibrate. And there you were. It was that simple. And incidentally, years later, the Smithsonian Institution, which has the Berliner microphone, lent it to me. I had to insure it. How much do you think they wanted me to buy the insurance for the microphone and Bell's telephone in my hot little hands? Million?
Million, yeah.
$2,500 a piece. But I had to pay for shipping. At any rate, I took the Berliner mic, hooked up a standard ohm meter of the time, and before the August Audio Engineering Society at a meeting in Los Angeles, I spoke into Grandpa's mic, and lo and behold, that meter defected like a volume indicator meter, but of course it wasn't indicating sound level. It was indicating variable resistance. And as I spoke louder, the pointer moved over this way, this way. And because there was less resistance as the sound was louder. So I proved it, the loose contact principle, right then and there, and or I reproved it. And that was a lot of fun, and it amazed a heck of a lot of people. And it also amazed me that the mic was still working after all those years, but then it was so simple, virtually nothing could go wrong with it. Now, we know that in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell, the great Canadian inventor, by the way, there was another I'll mention it in a minute. That'll be on my attack on Edison. That's that part of the talk. At any rate, Bell had invented the telephone in that whatever year I mentioned, and there were a lot of people, including Thomas Edison, who were out to improve the telephone because it had a basic flaw, and that, of course, was what telephone people refer to as the transmitter portion. We call it the microphone. They, to this day, refuse to use the word microphone, and telephone people are instructed to call it the transmitter. Anyway, and the earpiece is the receiver. Grandpa contacted Bell. Bell was in Boston, where the company originated. Grandpa was in Washington, D.C. He moved there from New York. And the famous Thomas Watson, remember Bell's report that where he had cut his hand in the laboratory and he yelled, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you." Watson was his assistant, and Watson heard his boss's voice through a telephone because they had one in each room. And that was the first communication over the phone that anybody had ever heard. That was the man who was sent to see Grandpa, and after seeing what Grandpa had, he said, Mr. Berliner, you will hear from us, we will want that. They did, and it wasn't until Grandpa's invention actually occurred in 1877, the year following Bell's introduction of the telephone. That is when, and it was not until 1878, believe it or not, that the Bell system acquired it. Now, what did they pay the old man for it? Well, the young man, who was 27 at the time, he was offered a princely sum. And the amount was $50,000 for the patent. Now, it's interesting that the Germans say he was offered $75,000. And the Canadians say, that's you folks, whether you know it or not, he was offered $100,000. Let's use the lower figure, be conservative. Let's say he was offered only $50,000. Now his German friends said to Emile, putting it out of context, he was also offered stock in the company instead of the cash. His German friend said, Emile, don't trust him. First of all, Western Union was dominating the communications business. They had made moves to get into the telephone business. They had acquired an Edison transmitter patent. The Bell system could go broke. It could never get lost. It's possible. Do not take stock in the company. Take the cash. And so then Grandpa made his first of many mistakes. You guessed it, he took the cash. He was earning $3 a week, selling housewares to housewives, door to door. He was called a drummer, by the way. That was the word for it. He was drumming up business. And at any rate, he said, he told Bell, I'll take the cash, and he got the cash. By the way, Bell's financing came substantially from his father-in-law, whose daughter Bell had married, and in the United States, the land of opportunity. And he had connections and used his connections to obtain financing for the American Bell Telephone Company. Anyway, and his daughter, what's his name? Vale. Miss Vale was deaf, and Bell was a teacher of deaf people. That's how they got together, and that's how they ended up. Anyway, here's Grandpa with his 50 grand. Many years later, the American government breaks up the Bell system. And the official divestiture day was January 1, 1986. Now, how much do you think his $50,000 worth of stock that he refused to take was worth on January 1, 1986?
A few more zeros.
A few more zeros. Yeah, on the left side of the decimal point. Would you believe 86 million? Don't. It's 1,086 million. Now when I meet Grandpa later on, I'll tell you what I'm going to say. I've already rehearsed it. Grandpa, couldn't you have taken 10% in stock? You would have got 45 grand in cash. That would have been enough for you. And just think, we'd have $100 million, your heirs. At any rate, that's my as you know, Edison's transmitter patent, which, by the way, used the loose contact principle, was acquired by Western Union. They immediately sued Bell for infringement on Edison's patent. Bell showed them the Berliner caveat, which had been filed in the U.S. Patent Office. The patent had never been issued, which is another story which we'll touch on very briefly. But at any rate, the caveat showed that Emile had applied for a loose contact design patent 13 days before Edison had. Therefore, the Edison patent, which had been issued, was worthless. The result of that was that Western Union agreed never to enter the telephone business. They agreed to assign the Edison patent to Bell. They also agreed that Bell System would acquire all the telegraph lines and all the telephone poles across the country that Western Union owned, and they even sold to Bell a company that they had formed called Western Electric, which became the manufacturing arm of the Bell System, and all of the Bell telephones were made by Western Electric Company. Western Electric got its name Western from Western Union. And how did Western Union name come about? Well, I'm not sure, but I think this company imagined itself as uniting the east of America with the west. That's the Western Union, as far as I can gather. So that's that story. And Edison, of course, was furious because he was expecting immense royalties. And the upshot of the association between Bell and Berliner was that Emile was given a job supervising the manufacture of telephones in Boston, and he stayed there for about 2 years. He then got permission from Bell to use the Bell-Berliner patent in Germany, and he formed the first telephone equipment manufacturing company in Hanover, Germany, the place where he was born. And that company later, to bring it around to you folks, went out of the telephone equipment manufacturing business, began manufacturing records, and the label was Deutsche Grammophon. So that's how that got started. Now, just wanted to let me see, check my notes here, if I can read them. I think I was suddenly taken drunk at the time. Yes, one of the interesting observations was that Bell tied up with his enemy, Edison, very readily. Bell was licensed by Edison to produce phonographs, and he formed the American Gramophone Company, which became the Columbia Gramophone Company, and he made a lot more cylinder phonographs than Edison ever made. Columbia was the leader in that field. And so here we have Edison, here we have Bell siding with Berliner in one area and siding with Edison against the Berliner disc in another area. Of course, when he started with Columbia, which is, of course, now the oldest record company in the world, not the oldest disc record company, but the oldest record label in the world. Discs hadn't come on the market as yet. Bell observed a very interesting thing. Others had, but he was the most notable person to observe that the problem with Hill and Dale recording, which Edison had instituted by accident, because it was easier to record Hill and Dale than it was to record lateral, despite the fact that he stole Leon Scott's design. He stole everything except the lateral cut. He went to vertical cut. He never regretted it. He always fought for it, saying that it was superior. Bell established that it was not superior because why? In vertical Hill and Dale recording, the needle going up and down makes its indentation only in the downward motion. All it does when it returns to its original resting point is come back out. It's just removing itself from the groove. So the recording was in effect half wave, whereas in Leon Scott's method of recording, lateral, you got the full wave, left, center, right. So one of the benefits of that, of lateral recording, was almost twice as much volume. And I have to tell you something about volume. You'll love this. It was known very early that volume is obtained by moving air. At any rate, Grandpa decided that one way for moving more air and getting more volume was to create this multiphone. And you've seen pictures of it. They actually made a few of them, and the multiphone was 6 gramophones playing 6 identical discs, powered by a motor, and it was said that over water you could hear the sound 2 miles away. That was pretty good. There is another story about Grandpa attempting to get more volume, and unfortunately I'm not permitted to tell you that story. But I will tell you this: if anybody asks me, I'll take you aside and tell you. But in front of the group, I'm not going to say it. If you hear the story, you'll know why. Anyway, Grandpa moved to Montreal to establish the record business in Canada. Why did he choose Montreal? Pardon me, Montreal. I must learn to pronounce it the Canadian way. I'm even trying to get my Canadian accent back. But the Canadian government won't let me. I've applied for citizenship because now the Canadian government allows former Canadians to get their Canadian citizenship back and have dual citizenship. I applied, I paid my $85 Canadian, and have been waiting a year, and just learned before I came up here that my application, although I met all the requirements, has been complicated by the fact that my father was an American, became a Canadian, went back and became an American again, and got his American citizenship, from which my American citizenship was derived. And unfortunately, I was a minor at the time, and so the Canadian government is giving me a hard time. Maybe they don't want me. Anyway, I'm hoping to solve that problem because I'd like to have my Canadian citizenship back, and we'll see how that goes. Now, where were we? Oh yeah, let's get to the Canadian company, which is probably what you're more interested in. Why was it founded in Montreal? Very simple. There were 2 or 3 reasons. First of all, at that time in 1900, Montreal was the center of Canadian commerce and the center of Canadian culture. And those were 2 good reasons. But the main reason was it was the closest Canadian big city to Philadelphia, where Grandpa had his operation functioning. And by the way, why did he go to Philadelphia? He lived in Washington. What was the reason for going to Philadelphia? In Philadelphia, there was a man by the name of Max Levy. Max Levy was the inventor of photo engraving. All of the pictures that got published in magazines and newspapers used the Max Levy's photo engraving principle. Grandpa, under his etching the human voice philosophy, felt that that was the ideal way to manufacture records. The same way they made the cuts, if you will recall, that were clamped onto a press and were used to stamp out photographs. And that was the manufacturing principle that Grandpa introduced. And so he wanted to be near Mr. Levy in order to get his expertise. And as you know, let's make this very clear, Grandpa never said he invented the disc record. He never said he invented the lateral cut. What he was trying to do with the invention of November 8, 1887 was to create a method of mass producing cylinders from a single master. That was his goal. He didn't even mention the disc record in his American patent. It is not mentioned. He did, however, refer to disc records in his German and British patents. Why didn't he mention them in the American patent? He thought he was legally prohibited from doing so. So it wasn't included. If you look at the American patent, there's no mention of the disc. In the European patents, however, he showed, and I would show you a little curiosity about that in a moment, he showed that discs should be recorded inside start, inside to out. He also showed that the recording should be on the bottom of the disc, which was done so that if you recorded on the bottom of the disc and were chipping away material in order to make your recording, the chip, as they called it, that was being scraped away would fall away and would not clog up the recording. That was the whole purpose of recording on the bottom, is so that the chip would fall out of the way. It was also the reason for recording inside start, because the chip would tend to go towards the center of the disc. So with inside start, the needle is going towards the outside while the chip is going to the inside and not clogging up the needle. So that's how that came about. Now, Emile had 3 sons and 3 daughters, and the 3 sons were pretty bright guys. Emile never went to college, of course, although in Germany he was hailed as Mr. Engineer, but he was not one. His 3 sons all graduated as mechanical engineers from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, which is the leading engineering school in North America. And so they were pretty bright guys. He sent Herbert up to Montreal to learn the record business. And the interesting thing was, although Herbert ended up running the business, legally he was not permitted to be president. The Canadian government had decreed that a Canadian must be the head of a company that's owned by a foreigner. So my grandfather engaged a man by the name of Emile Blount, to be the figurehead and to administer the business, whereas number one son, Herbert, was there to handle technical matters and manufacturing, that sort. So, but Herbert, of course, ended up running the company, and the Mr. Blount remained on, but he was strictly the figurehead. Herbert was running it. He did many great things. He put the company on the map. He also destroyed it. We'll get to that in a moment. At any rate, well, what comes up must come down, right? At any rate, Herbert, by the way, was believed to be the first Canadian disc jockey. And he took a gramophone at home. He took records at home. He would call up one of the Montreal stations, which later turned, it was an experimental radio station. This was in 1920 or 21. It later became the powerhouse station known as CFCF. And Herbert was doing remote broadcasts by telephone line, which of course became the standard in all over the world for broadcasting away from your station. Everything went over a telephone line. And he would play a record, and when the record was over, there would be silence. And sometimes he talked to what little audience he had, and sometimes he just took his time and found another record that he liked and put it on. And of course, they had a microphone. He had a microphone in front of the horn. It was the telephone, of course. And he just played records into the phone, and when he was finished, he just said goodbye, and he returned another day. So that was kind of cute. But one of his innovations was that actually Emile was not happy with, was Herbert's emphasis, and I think Uncle Herbert was right, on recording Canadian artists with this Canadian company. Incidentally, Emile owned the company entirely, but the Berliner Gramophone Company of the United States, Emile did not own. He had 10% interest in it. 90% was owned by the backers, but the important thing was, what Emile really wanted was royalties on his patents, and he got that. That was his main source of income, was not ownership in the company. And of course, you know that Emile had years of trouble trying to get the gramophone launched in the United States, and finally he went to Germany and persuaded the great doll maker Cameron Reinhardt to manufacture little miniature gramophones with 5-inch discs. And that's how the commercial record industry got launched, and many people thought, because of that, that Emile had envisioned his gramophone as purely a toy. They misled themselves because of the Cameron Reinhardt manufacturing situation. And by the way, the Kemmer discs were, as far as I know, all manufactured in New Jersey. Emile's voice, as you know, is on many of them, speaking in his English with a slight accent. His English was fluent, by the way, and but he never lost his accent. And he produced them for the European market in German and in English. And sometimes it was nursery rhymes like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. You remember that one. And there were other little ditties, many of which he sang himself. He was his own recording artist because he worked cheap. Anyway, I'm skipping, but let's get to some serious business. Herbert defied his father. Emile wanted a minimum of Canadian product and maximum of imported masters from the Victor Company in the United States. Reason, Victor had well-known artists, but the main reason, of course, was the masters didn't cost him anything. He hadn't produced them. He just got copies and banged out lots of copies. So there was no, it was very expedient to produce records where you didn't have to record the artists originally. Recording Canadian artists meant that the recording studio expense would be involved. And by the way, recording studios in those days were known as laboratories. Now they're recording studios. Anyway, Herbert was defying his father, and the company was prospering. They were up to 2 million discs a year in the early 1900s. That's pretty darn good, particularly for a small market like Canada, where the population of California today exceeds the population of Canada. By the way, a lot of Canadians go to California to die. The town of Long Beach is loaded. That's not why I left. I was dragged kicking and screaming to Maryland by my wife. She threatened me. She says, I'm moving to Maryland. You come or not as you see fit. And because she's 17 years younger than I am, I knew I needed somebody to nursemaid me in my old age, so I went. That is it. Anyway, let's see where we are here. Oh, okay. So Herbert accomplished great things for the company, but he headed the company to destruction, ultimately. Why? Because he neglected his father's company, founded the Campo Company, you all know that. It was mainly founded to record Canadian artists that Emile was not that anxious to record. The curious thing is, he grabbed off the Decca franchise, which was imported product from the U.S., so he wasn't against importing masters and just banging them out on the press here. And at any rate, here's the Campo Company. It's moving along, and of course there's this tremendous conflict of interest. Grandpa, in 1921, confronted him with this. They had a knockout battle, and it really was. They had an argument, I think the last of many. It was not the first. And they came to blows. Herbert struck his father, knocked him down, and that ended the relationship. He was kicked out immediately. That was his last day there. He knew that was it. Probably he planned it, although I don't think he planned to strike his father, but he did know that he was going to have to leave. And so he did. Then your friend Ed Moak began, more recent, long after, a study of the Berliner Gramophone Company of Canada. And Moak says in his book, a lot of you have seen it, that a strange thing happened at the Berliner Gramophone Company in 1921. For some reason, totally unexplained, all of the executives of the company resigned, and the company was left without officers or directors. This is absolutely true, but the reason you now know is this. The company had been run into the ground by Herbert. It was so inefficient that the secretaries had secretaries. My father said that was absolutely the case. The secretaries had secretaries, totally unnecessary, and money was being wasted like mad, and Herbert didn't care. In fact, maybe he wanted to destroy the company so that Campo would dominate the industry. Most likely that was the case. And so, Ed Moak observes in his book that this crazy occurrence where everybody resigned and there's the company with no leadership. That was contrived, of course. It was done on purpose, and the statement was made to Emile, we are unable to save this company. We owe you royalty money, and so we resign. This was a contrived arrangement between Emile, Blount, Edgar, my father, who would succeed his older brother Herbert, and that was done so that the next day it could open up as the new Berliner Gramophone Company under new management. It was the same people except for Herbert. So that is the answer to Ed Moak's question as to how did that happen, why did it happen? It's really, that's it. That is it. Let's see where we are now. In 1921, Edgar, my father, took over, and he brilliantly succeeded in restoring the company to prosperity. In 1924, a wonderful thing happened, wonderful for my dad and for me and everybody else. Emile gave the company to my father, gave him the Berliner Gramophone Company. My father always joked that his father had cut him out of the will.
Yeah.
That was a joke. Herbert was cut out of the will, however. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, big time.
And big time, right. And what did he do? He threatened his brothers and sisters that he would challenge the will in court if they did not give him his share. Question was, what was his share? What would it be? Well, I guess equal to the shares that his brothers and sisters were getting. This was in 1929 when Emile died. At any rate, he, under threat, Emile's children gave him a portion. They did not go to court. They did not rearrange the will, which they couldn't. They each of the 5 children, my father excluded, gave Herbert a share of their inheritance just to pacify him. They didn't want a battle. So that's how that worked. Oh yes, interesting thing, going back now, when Columbia Gramophone, owned by Alexander Graham Bell, sued the Berliner Gramophone Company for infringement on the Bell-Tainter, what the heck was it? Variable, oh Lord, I should know this. Well, Bell and Tainter, which was Chichester Bell, Alexander's cousin, and Charles Tainter had developed a method to solve a tremendous problem with Edison's phonograph, and that applied also to the Columbia Gramophone, which was the same instrument. And that is, they had to find a way where the feed screw, you could never drop the playback head into the groove properly under the feed screw system that Edison had developed. So with the Bell-Tainter invention, it didn't matter. You could move. It was the floating stylus. That's what it was, and you could properly position the playback stylus in the groove without any interference from the feed screw operation. So that was that saved the phonograph, by the way, because without it, the phonograph was suffering from difficulty in using it and difficulty in getting the needle in the start groove. At any rate, there came this patent, and Columbia was dying to get into the disc record business. And so they asked their lawyer, Philip Morrow, to figure out a way to attack the Berliner patent. And they suggested to Morrow, he did not suggest to them, that why don't we say that Emile Berliner's disc playback system infringes on our Bell-Tainter floating stylus patent. And Morrow's investigated and told the bosses, it won't work. You will never get away with that in court. You will never be able to prove that the Berliner playback method infringes on the floating stylus. Don't do it. They said, it's all we have to hang our hat on. We are going to do it, and you will be our lawyer. And so they sued through a complicated method that I will not go into. They sued the Berliner Gramophone Company and got an injunction preventing the Berliner Gramophone Company from making records or gramophones. That was a real blow. That was terrible for us. At any rate, Grandpa was legally stopped from making discs and players. But they also sued Eldridge Johnson, who was manufacturing the gramophones for Grandpa, and they blocked him. This guy, brilliant guy, was able to extricate himself from the lawsuit that was against him and Emile, and he told Emile, look, you license me to manufacture discs and machines. When all is said and done and the trial is over, I will account to you for everything that I've sold. And the Berliner Gramophone Company readily agreed to this. An interesting aspect of it was, and this answers the question, the Berliner Gramophone Company immediately sued, that's right, I'm sorry, he did not get licensed. He said, you let me do it. I'm sorry, I misspoke. That was the point. They said, we'll let you do it, but we gotta sue you because you're infringing on the Berliner patents. So they trumped up a lawsuit by agreement with Johnson. Another trumped up case. At any rate, Grandpa eventually won the case, as you know, and Victor settled, or I should say Johnson settled, in a very conspicuous way. By the way, the court ruled that the system, why did the Berliner playback system differ from Columbia Graphophone's bell-tainter system? It's because in the phonograph, the playback stylus is propelled by a feed screw. But in the disc system, the playback stylus is propelled by the groove. Big difference. And the court ruled there was no infringement, and Grandpa won the case, but they were broke. Johnson was thriving. He was doing great. Now it comes time for the reckoning. Well, the reckoning ended up that Johnson closed the Consolidated Talking Machine Company, which he had created to infringe on Berliner patents. And it went out of business, and a new company was formed, and of course, to commemorate the Berliner court victory, they named the company Victor Talking Machine Company. And that is how it got its name. If you've heard the stories of how Johnson named it after his bicycle, named the company after his right-hand man's wife, Victoria, wrong. It was named for the court victory, and I've got proof of that because when Eldridge Johnson retired in 1927, his son Fenimore took over. My father knew him very well, called him Fen, like all his friends did. And Fen personally told me, my father named the company Victor because it meant winner. And there you go. Anyway, getting down to the end here. Let's see, we got through the Herbert suing his brothers and sisters. And, okay. When my father took control of the company and owned it, thanks to a gift from his father, he by then realized that the Berliner Gramophone Company should become part of Victor. And so he sold the Berliner Gramophone Company of Canada to the Victor Talking Machine Company,